Down the Garden Path, where each week we discuss down to earth tips and advice while doing our best to help you seasonally manage your garden and landscape. I'm Joanne Shaw, owner of Down to Earth Landscape Design, and I believe it's important and possible to have great gardens which are sustainable, low maintenance, and I want to help you make it happen. Matt Dressing, my usual co host, is under the weather today, so I'm going solo. Just when we think about our topic here, just when we think we've seen it all regarding our garden and pest issues, we learn about another pest we need to educate ourselves about. Today, we are discussing jumping worms, what they are, why we need to be on the lookout for them in our gardens. And to do a deep dive on this topic, I have asked Sean James, owner of Sean James Consulting, to join me on the show to discuss jumping worms, why we need to be on the lookout for them. Everyone knows Sean, but Sean also, in addition to being a consultant, also designs gardens, speaks, and teaches, especially on social media, all about gardening and doing it in an eco-friendly way. Welcome to the show, Sean.
Thank you so much. And you touched on something really neat in the introduction. If you're bored in horticulture, you're doing it wrong. There's so much to learn every day.
Yeah.
Just when you think you knew it all is a forever learning thing.
Yeah.
Every day there's new stuff to learn. I just was listening to a presentation last night on the evolution of plants by Daryl Blay from the Niagara Park School for the Master Gardeners, and was quite fascinated to find out that water lilies were the first blooming plant. I really, that caught me off guard. I thought, that's so cool. And every day, if you're doing it right, every day is full of, no kidding, that's cool.
Yeah. Yeah, that is really interesting. I was recently at Longwood and learned about and he was and I'm feel bad that I forget the gentleman's name, but he was telling us he did a little like 10-minute speech about, and who knew there was that much to talk about with water lilies and water plants, and he's standing in there in the pools and describing everything around us, and it was just fascinating. And yes, and that is one topic we haven't done on the show, but that is very interesting to learn that they were one of the first plants or the first plant.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was magnolias, but no. Although magnolias were pollinated by beetles. Beetles were the first pollinators. So that's neat too. Like it's just a never-ending process of no kidding.
Yes, yes. No kidding. See, and I don't know why I would have thought it would have been trees, like a certain kind of, well, you said magnolia, but that's flowering. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure many people
Neat.
would say an apple tree. Right?
Yeah,
You have to ask.
what we're most used to. And they seem simple, although they really aren't.
No, for sure, for sure. So this is a new and kind of new topic, but I think many of our listeners may not be aware. And it sounds harmless when you call them jumping worms, but they are not a kid's toy, are they?
No, you're right. They sound downright cute. Oh, but no, they're potentially, well, not, they're going to be devastating.
Yes.
So I'm really glad that you're giving me the opportunity to spread the word.
Well, thank you. I really want to help get the word out, and I want to educate myself as well. So what exactly are jumping worms?
Well, I'm going to start with the idea that, with a couple of really rare exceptions, all of our worms are not native. In pretty much west of the Rockies and north of the deep south, anywhere the glaciers went, anywhere that got glaciated, it sounds like a punishment. Anywhere that got glaciated, the worms got pushed back and didn't return on their own. It wasn't until the pioneers brought worms with them in soil that they were bringing with plants and such that they got spread around. And then as horticulturists move plants around, that moves the worms further. And interestingly, fishermen, that worms have a pretty good cheering squad. There's a really good podcast called In Defense of Plants, and he was talking about worms, and he said they have a pretty good cheering squad. So, when you're out fishing and you might be way out in the middle of nowhere and you've got a few worms left over, and I'm going to do nature a favor and dump them in place, and then that spreads them, which, I mean, who cares? Well, the thing is that they disrupt our local ecology overall. Like, how can worms affect trees negatively? Our trees, again, since the glaciers, they adapted to living without worms. The slower release of nutrients broken down by fungi and mulchers like millipedes and sow bugs and that sort of thing. a slow release of nutrients. So the nutrients get leached away. They're released too quickly. The trees and the plants and the perennials can't take them up fast enough. So they leach away. And they also are soil engineers. And there's a study about how worms in general, I mean, everybody thinks worms are great, but for native plants, they're not. And when they get into the wild, which is the big fear with specifically jumping worms, they really throw the ecology out of whack. So they slow down the growth, for instance, of our native plants, and that makes it easier for invasive species to move in. So things like buckthorn can move farther faster because of worms. Like it's an odd relationship, but it becomes a sort of cascade of events that makes this worse. Then the native plants are doing more poorly. Then the deer population goes up because the plants are weaker, so they're feeding heavily on the native plants, and that makes more room for the invasive species. You wouldn't think, who would have thought that it would be such a big thing and a big cascade of events? And the jumping worms in particular do what worms do, but way more. And that actually reduces the effectiveness and the diversity of all the little creepy crawlies that live in the soil that used to do their job really, really well. Forest soil should be spongy, and it is less, considerably less so when worms are around. But the jumping worms feed near the surface and really, really, really quickly. They're aggressive feeders. So they really quickly break down all that stuff, all the stuff that falls off the trees, falls off nature onto the ground, where the salamanders live, where the bugs live, where seeds stay dormant until it's the time for them to germinate. So I'm a birder. I didn't want to be a birder. Birders are weird. It just sort of happened. And we were quite excited this year. We had an eastern towhee, which is sort of like a sparrow in a tuxedo. And they're a ground feeding bird. Turkeys, partridges, lots of birds are ground feeding birds. And when all that cover goes away, not only is there no home for cute little creatures like wood frogs, but there's no home for all the spiders and beetles and so on that live on top of the soil, but in the leaf litter. That leaf litter is gone. Where do they live? So now, again, you get this cascade of events where all those things are gone. So now there's nothing for the birds to feed on. The birds, of course, move around a lot of the tree seeds, berries, and so on. So now you don't get the seeds moving around. You don't get the regeneration of the forest. When jumping worms get into the natural areas, it's going to be absolutely devastating because it's going to change the whole ecology. So we've got to figure out a way to recognize them and slow the movement into the forests until maybe we find a way to deal with them, and or nature finds a way to adapt a little bit. Slowing the process is key.
Yes. So in our home gardens, we need to also be aware, right? That's the one thing we can control. I totally want to, also talk about the forest, but in our home gardens, what would be the first identifier that we may have have jumping worms in our gardens?
Sure. Yeah. I want to be very black and white about this.
Okay.
Because I know, for the Joe citizen and Josephine citizen out there, we like nice, clear facts. But it's not always so clear with jumping worms. If you see a worm in the spring, it's not a jumping worm. They don't come out. They're actually an annual worm, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
The adults don't live through the year. They lay eggs at the end of the year, and then they, as near as I understand it, those go immediately into a cocoon form, and that's how they overwinter. So they're these little, they're smaller than regular worms. They do have a different shape and color, and they act differently, but you don't see them in the springtime because they're just really, really small at that time of year, itty bitty things. A jumping worm, whereas a regular worm might be up to 30 centimeters, jumping worms, and there's a few different species. They're from Asia, and they're generally 7 to 20 centimeters long, depending on species. And they're reddish brown to gray. They are more rigid. So our worms tend to be a little bit more flaccid. These have sort of more solidity to them.
Okay.
They have, so everybody's seen worms, and
Mhm.
most people would have noticed that there's sort of a thickening on a worm where the hearts are. That's called the clitellum. And on a jumping worm, the clitellum is flush with the body. It's not raised.
All right.
And it goes all the way around. I had never noticed that thickening on a worm is sort of saddle shaped. It doesn't go all the way around on the other species of worms. Okay. And now apparently you have to euthanize them. I imagine you could just put them in the fridge for a while and slow them down
Mhm.
to be able to look that closely and see it. And like if you're really concerned, um, like if you think you have jumping worms, then you can I would say put them in the fridge for a while and make them go to sleep. And then you can actually, worms have segments, and a regular worm has, like 20 plus segments, up to 28 segments.
Okay.
Jumping before the clitellum, from the head to the clitellum, because they do have a head. And a jumping worm has 14 segments. So you could actually take a magnifying glass and count,
Yeah.
with that big a difference, you're going to get close. So if it's 14 segments to the clitellum, wow, I sound way. It is advanced. This stuff is
Yeah.
advanced. It
Mhm.
can't and shouldn't dumb it down for folks.
Mhm.
Um, so um, it's really easy to move them around. The cocoons are very small. The eggs are like poppy seeds. So you would get them. I know a landscaper in Toronto who carries wire brushes with his crew. I was so impressed. I was telling him I was going to be on this podcast, and they clean their boots when they leave a job. I was super,
Oh.
super impressed by that. So that they're not moving them in egg or cocoon form from job to
Mhm.
job. I was on a job the other day in Toronto, and a landscaper stopped by one of his customers' places. His customer gave him permission to dump leaves into the ravine. And I'm like, you really shouldn't be moving leaves around. I used to steal my neighbor's leaves. And now we don't want to do that. You want to keep everything on your property as much as
Mhm.
possible.
Mhm.
Keep the leaves there, keep the soil there. Don't bring new soil on. If you're going to buy plants, you should probably be washing the roots off really well, um, and disposing of that soil in the garbage, not on the
Okay.
compost pile, and making sure that you're not bringing them onto your property. Because even in a home garden,
Mhm.
they you might know what worm castings look like. They're
Mhm.
kind of crumbly and largish by comparison. Uh, Jumping worm castings look like coffee grounds
Okay.
on the soil, and they only feed. They do go deeper, but generally they're only in the top couple of
In the
inches.
surface. Yeah.
So they do all their damage right on the surface.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to see your worms, odd sentence. If you water the soil with water mixed with ground up mustard seed, like
Oh.
mustard seed powder, that
Okay.
is irritating to the worms. It doesn't hurt them, but it brings them to the surface. So really only, late summer are you going to see them. But if you water with water with mustard seed in it, then that's going to bring the worms to the surface, and then you can see what you've got.
Yeah.
They also, because their body's so rigid, they basically thrash around when disturbed.
Yeah.
Because their body's so rigid, they can like come off the ground. Like it's aggressive. If you
Okay.
just search jumping worms videos, you'll
Mhm.
see
You'll see. Yeah.
how creepy they are. And they sort of call like they travel in colonies. It's most worms you're going to see like one or two, and you'll see a lot of jumping
Okay.
worms as well.
Now I've seen a few
So that the
pictures.
colors,
Sorry, I've seen
yeah,
a few pictures,
yeah,
and they also have the white band. Is that
that's the
like
clitellum.
that's a clitellum? Okay, so it is
Yeah,
it, on
and
an
it's
earthworm, a typical
flush.
worm. Okay, it's flesh.
Yeah, yeah, it's flush on a jumping worm, raised on a typical worm.
Okay.
And if you were to put them to sleep, you maybe could see that it goes all the way around.
Mm.
And it's white as opposed
Yes.
to pink on a regular worm,
Okay.
whitish, creamy colored.
Yeah.
And they usually darker, like sort of a brownish color. Apparently, they're darker brown on their back. But how do you tell which side's its back?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good luck with that.
I'm good, but I'm not that good.
Yeah.
Um, so those are the big things. They're smaller, later in the season.
Hmm.
They're darker color, less slimy. They're not so slimy. And that clitellum is white and flush with the rest of the body. Whitish and
Hmm.
flush.
Okay. And if you would you see the
Yeah.
coffee grounds? Like, would you start to see?
Not always. None
Okay.
of this is always,
Right.
unfortunately. So
Yeah.
you add up all the clues together and
Hmm.
then you can take a stab at thinking, okay, I think I have these. And then you can go deeper and count the segments to the clitellum, 14 segments from the
Hmm.
clitellum,
Okay.
and look and see, euthanize them or whatever, and see if the clitellum goes all the way around. But
Right.
that's less sure.
Mm.
But you're adding everything up together and getting a good idea, and then you can go from there.
Okay.
And what do you do if you have them? You just
Yeah.
make really sure that you're not moving them from place to place. Even like we have an informal policy at my company. I guess all policies are informal. That's the
Hmm.
idea. It's not the law. It's just an informal idea that we try and do this. And so we don't bring soil onto a site. We don't take soil off of a site, and we try and recycle any nutrients on the site. So what falls on the property stays on the property.
Okay.
Because even if you're sending it away to the municipal compost site, and they should be killing them there,
Mm.
if the pile heats up to 40 degrees Celsius for 3 days, then that should kill the worms and the cocoons and the eggs. But what about the stuff that's around the edges?
Yeah.
The people at the landfill or at the compost facility could be picking them up on their boots and taking them away. Um, so, and it would also reduce our taxes. If we can get people, instead of trucks coming and taking them away every fall, if you can mulch them on the site, and you can mulch fully up to a foot of leaves onto your lawn and your garden without hurting the lawn and garden.
Mm.
That's super important to remember. People say, "Oh, I get way too many leaves." No, you really don't.
Yeah.
It's just good for your garden. So
Hmm.
there are upsides to this situation in that it makes us aware of the of some of the good things you can do for your garden as well. Some of the talking points are beneficial, I
Right.
guess is what I'm trying to say there.
Okay. Yeah,
So
it always amazes me. There's so many people that don't really touch their garden the whole year, but they're out there. I mean, certainly they cut their lawn, but then they're out there,
yeah,
worrying about the leaves and getting the leaves all out of the garden and doing all the things that they really don't need to do, when they could have been doing
yeah,
other things, all summer. But yes, this need to put the garden to bed and have it be spotless before the first snowfall. We
because that's what they
really,
see the professionals doing. I don't blame them.
mm,
And the professionals do it because they think that the customer needs it or wants it.
yes.
Somehow we got to break that cycle, and that's all
Hmm.
about education. So again, thank you for what you do,
Yeah, yeah.
because getting the word out to people is key. And there's so many places we can learn good information, like the Master Gardeners of Ontario Facebook page
Hmm.
is riddled with really good stuff. They've got all kinds of articles on jumping worms actually on there, which is super super cool. Um, oh, by the way, there's one more super cool and
Okay.
freaky thing that jumping worms do that other worms don't. They drop their tail. They can just have a segment of it fall off. Yeah, I know.
Really?
That's a great
Well, I didn't
face.
know worms.
Yes,
Yeah,
that
woo,
was
we weren't videoing it, but I didn't
yeah,
even know worms had tails. Really?
yeah. Well, that the
Yeah.
whole thing, if you cut a worm in half, you get two worms, is a myth.
Yes.
The
Oh,
half
okay.
with the heart, the clitellum, if that's not damaged, then the worm can regenerate. But the other half may thrash around, but it's done.
Okay.
So yeah, they have heads and tails. Food goes in one ending,
Yeah. Food goes
castings come out the
go
other.
the other.
I love all the different words we have for poop. Insects have frass, worms have castings.
Yes.
It's fun.
Uh, so okay, so if we were when you said washing, so and I was mentioning before we went live about garden clubs are concerned
Yep.
because of their plant sales are a big part of their fundraising, and the word is kind of trickling down that we may have to take better, more precautions in when we're sharing plants with friends or selling them in that kind of, taking them from your garden and moving them to somebody else's
Even the
garden.
nurseries, in
Oh,
all
so is it,
fairness.
yeah, so is it a nursery thing? So I order plants
Sure.
from my grower, so is it
Yeah.
something that we're going to have to start doing?
So the garden clubs can be um, bare rooting the plants, washing the root systems, and really well, and then repotting them with fresh compost that's properly sterilized, properly heated up. The nurseries, if they're using a good compost, because they use a compost mix for potting stuff nowadays,
Mhm.
if they're doing that, then their plants should be safe.
Okay.
Some of the smaller nurseries, that's a little tougher for them to do.
Yeah,
And I'm not saying that smaller is bad. I think we got to support our crazy little garden centers run by crazy little
absolutely.
gardeners. That's where the
Yeah.
cool stuff comes from.
Hmm.
Um, what so I, People don't realize that Landscape Ontario, our big provincial trade group, does a lot for the environment. They have a Smart About Salt campaign. They have a Water Smart Irrigation Professionals certification. There's the Fusion Gardening certification
Hmm.
for sort of dovetailing rain gardens and the ilk with drought tolerant landscaping. There's a lot of good things that they do. And the so they're looking at, how do we deal with jumping worms? Because we don't want to be the people, the professionals don't want to be the people spreading these around.
Right.
So some places in the States have fast tracked a bacteria which is only goes after earthworms.
Okay.
So it's a targeted, it's like BT only goes after caterpillars. That's
Okay.
Bacillus thuringiensis. So there's a bacteria called Bovaria bassiana, and unfortunately, I don't have a common name for you there, but
Okay.
it's a bacteria that just targets um, the earthworms,
All
and
right.
so all earthworms. But keep in mind, like we said way back at the beginning, worms are not from here anyway.
Hmm.
And if a lot of our plants in the gardens are European in our home gardens, and so they grew up with worms, they're
Right.
friends, so they may benefit from worms, but it doesn't. It actually hurts the soil biodiversity and hurts our native plants. And so many people are looking to promote save the bees, save the monarchs, and are looking to promote better information and
Hmm.
better plants, better native plants that are going to do more. And the big thing that we forget there, sorry for tangenting, but is host plants. It's less about saving the pollinators. There are specialty pollinators, and it's good to plant for those guys. But it's more about host plants for caterpillars because the caterpillars are the beginning of the food chain.
Right.
The plants take the sun's rays and make them into energy and then carbohydrates, and then the insects get the carbohydrates and convert them into food for the birds. So everything begins there. And Mama Chickadee needs 6,000 caterpillars for a clutch of young. So it's really important that we plant host plants, things that
Mhm.
the insects can feed on, not pollinate, but feed on.
Feed on. Yeah.
And if you have one, then you will be doing the other. If you're
Right.
planting host plants, cool things like New Jersey tea and lupins and so on. Even grasses and asters are food. Grasses are food for sulfur butterflies and common ringlets. Excuse me. And asters are food, for instance, for curly crescents, like a little miniature monarch. They eat aster leaves. So you're by doing that, and monarchs feed on milkweed, and like
Milkweed.
marsh milkweed is such a good rain garden plant, but good for the regular garden too. So
Hmm.
now you're supporting all of the things that feed on milkweed, not just monarchs. Remembering that it's about biodiversity overall and host plants especially when we're
Hmm.
choosing our plants. That's a way to make a really big difference in our
Yeah.
gardens.
Yeah. That sounds like that's a whole
But yeah,
show. Talk about host plants.
right.
Hmm.
If if we could fast track this nematicide, then so basically it takes a long time to get a product legalized in Canada,
Yeah.
and then you're only allowed to use it for its on product use. So
Okay.
only for certain usages, right? I can only use uh, Garlon on buckthorn, say. That's not actually a real example. Uh, but there's specific uses.
Hmm.
So if you can fast track the not only the certification of the product, but also what you can use it on, then all nurseries, and even hopefully garden clubs could treat their potted plants before they're sold. And you know me, I'm not a pro spray guy,
Yeah.
but there are, when you do the math, where I live just north and west of Milton on a really wild property. And when we moved in, there were thousands of buckthorns, huge buckthorns. People were saying, you should dig them out. First of all, you're hurting the roots of all the plants around it when you do that. But more importantly, it just wasn't tenable.
Yeah.
And we had Phragmites all around the pond, 6 feet back from the pond. There's no other way to control it. So we pulled out the chemical guns. We hired a company called EnviroSpray to control the invasive species, and they used a product called Garlon on buckthorn. And I know everybody hates Roundup, but when you do the math, they used Roundup Weathermax on the Phragmites because there's new research that it's not bad for aquatic life. And the next year, all the Phragmites was gone, and the turtles were nesting all around the pond. So it freed up habitat, and all sorts of plants are repopulating that area naturally. So sometimes it's just not tenable to do it by hand, and even if it's a Sherman tank of a chemical like Garlon, you limit the use of it and use it in the right way. So oh God, spraying chemicals on the soil to kill these worms, terrible. Yeah, but it's much more terrible if it gets into the forest. Bad for your garden in general, terrible for the forest. And all you have to do is walk through your garden and then go for a hike. And you've carried them all through the woodlands.
And then the opposite, anybody who's a hiker can then just bring them into their own garden.
That's right.
That is
we are the vector.
I did not realize that. Now, is that an issue like only in the spring because that's when they're in their little cocoons? Or is it even in the summer when they are worms? Like, are there still is the life cycle that fast that they're laying eggs that we could still?
I don't know that for sure, and I don't want to say something that I'm not absolutely sure about. My impression is that they're pretty communicable, as it were, most of the time. You're not going to see them until late summer, and then but you could be spreading them around at any time, and I imagine there's probably there might be a gap of a few weeks as they mature. You know how long it takes an earthworm to mature, just a standard earthworm?
No.
How long do you think?
I would think it's pretty fast. Like I would think it's.
You would, yeah. How does the number 15 years sound?
No. Oh my.
Yeah,
really?
It takes 15 years for an earthworm to mature. That just blew me out of the water. We think that we're big and complex, and that's why we take so long to mature, but it's not universal. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, me too.
So not moving organic matter, even not moving soil around is going to help slow the spread until we get a nematicide, a chemical that kills worms, nematodes, registered. Then we can clean the roots of plants, moving them around, try and deal with a reputable nursery, and talk to them about it. And if you get a glassy-eyed stare, then maybe be a little careful buying plants from them.
Yes.
Because I have heard tales of nurseries that have had jumping worms. Because they can move from pot to pot. They're so fast moving and aggressive that they could move from the soil. Oh, I keep my plants on tarps. Yeah, but they can climb. They can, get over the edge of a tarp and then get into the plants, and then they're mobile. Or you put a plant down on the ground overnight, and now they've come up through the holes in the plant. The number of times that I've bought plants that had earthworms in them, and of course until recently I thought, oh hey, that's good, earthworms. Living and learning.
Yeah.
And folks shouldn't beat themselves up about having done something wrong, because we didn't know. You're trying to learn. It's like the invasive species plant issue. People have done bad things accidentally. No one goes, I'm going to mess up the environment and plant some non-native honeysuckles. That doesn't happen. Well, I'm sure there's someone out there, but we don't want to know them. It's just a question of realizing what's happened and figuring out how to move forward from it.
Okay.
That's the secret, and spreading the word. Don't be
Yeah.
Canadian and sit in the corner and wait for people to notice you. We don't really use water coolers a lot anymore, but
Mm-hmm.
talk to your friends, talk to your
Mm-hmm.
gardening groups. I'm sure a lot of your listeners are members of garden clubs,
Mm-hmm.
and if they're not already talking about it, well,
Yeah.
get them
They
talking about
need
it.
to be.
It's not something to be feared. Change is necessary, and
Yeah.
especially in a situation like this, change is super necessary. Um, so yeah, and be part of groups that learn from uh, from these situations.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's all quite interesting, and there is something that we can do about it. But sharing the knowledge is probably the most important thing that we can do,
Yes. Yeah.
letting everybody know about it.
Should we also be concerned about our compost, where we're getting the compost from? Like, I know you're saying about not moving, keeping and when we install gardens, we do tend to remove some soil and bring in new soil. So we'll talk to my
Yeah,
contractors about that practice. But we
yeah.
also, and mulch, and I want to get to mulch too. But yeah, so if we go through the practice of washing our pots or washing our roots, and then you said repotting them, and even for the growers to repot them or garden centers to repot them in better, quote unquote, better soil, like how do we know,
Mhm.
that it is the best, compost?
So
I mean,
there,
even the bagged stuff that people are getting from the big box stores.
yeah. So I mean, for instance, as with all things, you try and find a good supplier.
Hmm.
So there's a place up in St. Jacobs called, well, near St. Jacobs called Elm View Farms. And I had a pile of their composted mulch. So I guess that's point number one. I would use composted mulch. And I don't incorporate it into the soil because that breaks apart the soil microbiome. I put it on the surface
Okay.
and let nature work it in. I don't use, on the rare instances that I bring soil onto a job, I just use screened topsoil, which has nothing to do with jumping worms, but more to do with I think when we use triple mix, we think our job is done,
Hmm.
organic matter wise.
Hmm.
And the truth is that in a year or two, all that organic matter is going to subside. It's going to break down and disappear. So it's better to institute a program of mulching and then nutrient recycling. Mulching at the beginning, and then I do a technique called let it lay, where I just cut the garden down in the spring in 3-inch increments, spread it out if necessary, and leave it. And that's my mulch. And that forms habitat for all the beneficial beetles. And, rove beetles and ground beetles eat the snail and slug eggs. So that makes your life better. It's cheaper. It looks good. When the first time I did it, I thought, oh, this is gonna look cheesy. I don't think I'm gonna like this. And stood back and went, oh, it looks like I just spent a lot of money on mulch. So we just use green topsoil, and then we buy composted mulch from a really good supplier. This Elmview Farms, there I had no weed seeds. The pile sat
Mm.
for a year and no weed seeds. So
Okay.
I know that they're heating it up enough to kill whatever is in it. If it's killing the seeds, then it's killing the pathogens.
Mhm.
Interestingly, it doesn't kill the beneficial creatures, which is kind of funky. But it does kill the bad things in the garden.
Okay.
And it'll kill the so if you're buying good mulch, then it should have killed the jumping worms as well.
Okay.
So
So yeah, we tend to,
okay.
I love composted pine mulch is what I tend
Yep.
to recommend for my clients to use. Um, but doing a screened, so instead of doing removing soil, are you thinking just bringing in the screens topsoil on top of
Yeah.
what the client might already have?
Yes. Yeah. I don't till at all.
Okay.
Not even a little bit.
Not even a little. Excellent.
Um, yeah. I again that Teaming with Microbes book that I mentioned before we went on
Mm-hmm.
air, or live, is not not a well, it's not a bad read. I was going to say it's not a light read, but it's interesting enough that it's gripping. It's
Okay.
still a page turner,
Mm-hmm.
and it's so packed with information that you don't have a problem um turning the pages. And
Right.
and they will talk a lot about not breaking up the soil microbiome. So when you turn the soil, most people nowadays, most on-the-ball gardeners know about mycorrhiza, the beneficial fungus that
Mm-hmm.
helps move nutrients, helps plants communicate with each other, helps plants take up water, cool themselves, and so on. You break up those hyphae. You break up that mycorrhizal web. There are bacteria that glue the soil together. They make little colonies and they release a really strong glue that we're actually looking into for making glue. uh, you break those up. So
Okay.
now those colonies do less well and it takes them a while to regenerate. And that's what the earthworms do as well. They do what our native soil fauna does, but not as well. Yes, they're aerating.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, they're moving nutrients around. Yes, they're breaking down organic matter, but they're doing it out of sync with our native species.
I see. Okay.
So yeah.
So just to talk a little bit more about the specific damage. So the worms are, depleting the soil basically, and it really
Mhm.
causes the plants to not be able so that just so I want our listeners to really understand that it's not something that's going to happen overnight, right? It's not like Japanese beetles in our lawn where we see the damage right away.
Hmm.
It may take like if you have them, it probably like how long before you see the damage or your plants start to suffer. I mean, it all depends on the plant,
That's going
right?
to vary
Yeah.
too much from site to site, from
Yes.
property to
Okay.
property. They might
Okay.
be better or worse. I don't
Mm-hmm.
actually know. In sandy
Okay.
soil, to be honest, it's not just me. We are still learning about these things. They're pretty
Yes.
new here. They've
Mm-hmm.
been doing a slow burn in the States, and maybe that's what you really need to remember is that most invasive species, you're right, it's not an overnight light switch click and there
Mm-hmm.
they are thing. It's a slow burn. People might be shocked to know that burning bush is
Mm-hmm.
invasive.
Yes.
And, oh, come on, I've never seen it move around. The more generations you get from the cultivars that we buy at the nursery, so maybe only 3 or 4 seeds a year might germinate. But then when they get big enough, they'll cross pollinate, and then the birds take the seeds, move them into the wild, and then you get more and more of them. 5 or 6 years ago, we pulled out 200 burning bush on a friend's property, and there were some seedlings that were too small. She's got about 300 now. Now
Oh.
they're smaller, so they're easier to pull out. We use something called an extractigator, which is a big lever with teeth on the end that pulls out invasive
Yeah.
species. But the neighbor still has 3 giant burning bush.
Mm.
And when you look close, it's like hair underneath all the baby burning bushes, plus the ones that the birds are taking out into the forest that she's trying to keep clean next door.
Mm. Yeah.
It's these things are slowly devastating,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to communicate to people who haven't seen it in
Yeah.
person the severity of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's tough to get traction with folks,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it cannot overstate how important it is.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing, I don't know, I'm sure you found this too, where clients that love when they call you and they say, "Oh, I back onto conservation or I back onto the woodland or I back onto,
Mm.
no one's ever going to develop it and it's going to be such a great oasis." And that's great if you're a gardener and if you are out there, but really I try to say to people like it's going to come to you. Like you are going, or what you plant is going to go to them. So it is a really important thing to learn, and it's great that you have that
Yeah,
property, right? Conservation or no neighbors behind you, but I think the greater understanding that nature is coming to you, and whatever you do in your space you're going to affect behind you as well or
yeah.
beside you, that
You
type
have a
of
new
thing.
responsibility that you didn't have at your old house.
Right.
You've got this new wonderful place. Now you need to steward it. You need to
Mhm.
think twice about, gosh, I just love Crimson King maples.
Mm.
Great, good for you. They're beautiful. Next to impossible to garden under. But
Mhm.
maybe you need to look at native species like um, ruby lace honey locust, for instance. Lovely, plays well
Mhm.
with others, fertilizes the plants around it, has a dappled shade, and it's a native, a cultivar, a variety of a native plant. And you're doing no harm, or at least look at things that aren't invasive. So let's say you love that purple foliage, maybe look at purple European beech, any of the purple European beeches to give you that
Mhm.
purple. And there are other plants. Some of them are better than others. Schubert cherry used to be great, and then we
Yeah.
overused it in our landscapes, and now there's a disease called black knot that's everywhere. So overusing any one plant is a problem.
Yeah.
But you're to claw our way back to what you were saying.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right that if you have a property that is natural or not, but borders on a natural area, then it behooves you to be careful what you bring onto the property, and also I would say to control the invasives that are on your property. Like as I said, we controlled the Phragmites and the buckthorn, and I've
Hmm.
even got my lovely neighbors letting me help them with control on their
Oh,
property.
that's great.
Um, because people just don't know. Like it's
Yeah.
not that, like I said, people are bad. They want to do the right thing.
Yes, they just don't
So
know.
once they know, then they're like, yeah, sure, great, I'd love to
Yeah.
help. So,
One of the last gardens that I did this fall was just covered in, it really wasn't a garden anymore because it was filled with goutweed. So we
mm,
did, so that
mm,
was a case. Is that a case? Like, was it okay? And we did remove, I said to the guys, like, please try to remove as much soil as possible because, a little piece of root for
yeah,
goutweed and it's all back,
yeah,
right? And there's
yeah.
nothing worse than putting in a brand new garden for somebody and, that being covered again in goutweed. Um,
We
yeah.
we we have encountered the same problem, and with other species as well, like lily of the valley, which is actually
Mm,
poisonous, and
mm,
allelopathic. It kills the plants around it, slows their growth, and kills them.
mm.
But we have, gosh, I'm gonna have to get over this. I still feel like a monster when I say it. We've been using Enviro spray to control these things because
Okay.
I don't want to be moving the soil around. I don't
Okay.
know. It depends on how it's disposed of, right? If it goes to a municipal compost site
Mm,
and they're super careful, then
mm.
hooray. But if
Yeah.
they're not,
Yeah.
then that's going to cause a lot of problems.
Okay.
So the more we can keep things in place, the better. And so again, when I do the math, I'm like, okay, we can't leave these things because they're causing problems. These are drifting over into the neighbor's property,
Hmm.
for instance. So I have resolved myself to use the chemical guns when necessary.
When
Because
necessary.
if the customer has the labor and the desire, or if there's a volunteer group or whatever that can for a year and then again the next spring use a fork to weed out the root pieces. We've almost controlled the goutweed in the front gardens at my house
Hmm.
manually.
Okay.
But it was also, I have a feeling this was a farmstead at one time
Mm.
because there's neat non-native things like perennial sweet pea in the back
Oh,
of the property.
okay.
So that kind of tells me that someone was here before. Lilac as
Mm.
well is a good indicator.
Mm.
But there's goutweed all over the property. So again, the chemical guns, we've been concentrating on the Phragmites, but now that it's mostly under control, then I can look at some of the other things that if
You
I can
control.
control them, then I can increase biodiversity overall. And I think
Mm.
a lot about that here. We
Hmm.
we it's a rental house, to be honest,
Hmm.
and we were obligated to mow. Well, policies. So we're mowing both
Yeah.
sides of the pond, but we've created little biodiversity islands around all the trees.
Okay.
And then on the other side of the pond, we just started mowing pathways. We're still mowing it.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
boy, oh boy, the butterflies and the dragonflies.
Oh,
There's butterfly counts in every major community.
yes.
And the Hamilton study area is quite large. And they were bemoaning the fact that there were no meadow fritillaries, another little small monarchy looking thing. And I wrote to them, I said, that's because they're all at my house. We have a lot of violets in the lawn, and we have tons of these really
Yeah.
rare little butterflies. And I love my knot lawn. It's green all the time. There's
Hmm.
lots of flowers. There's lots of bumblebees. Things like self-heal, Prunella vulgaris, Viola lepidorica. Heck, we have an orchid that is a lawn weed here. And my kind of weed, it's
Wow.
amazing. Yeah, Sphinx lady tresses, we have hundreds of them. We even have yellow lady slipper orchids growing up in the lawn. And
Oh my
who
gosh.
else? Lobelia syphilitica, great blue lobelia, thousands of great blue lobelia. And
Oh
it's just
my.
glorious in the summertime. And that's actually food for a specialty bee. The endangered American bumblebee feeds on great blue lobelia. So now I got to learn how to ID it so that I can see if we have it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
which
That
is
is,
fun.
yeah. And now, like, that is just natural. Like, you didn't add, let's say, clover or
No,
anything. Like, you haven't added
oh
anything.
gosh, no.
No, you've just let it
Um,
be.
yeah, whenever you can just get out of nature's way, and this was a wetland forest a long time ago. And back in the 80s, when we didn't know any better, they dug this sort of necklace of ponds that runs through the center of the property. And then they use that fill to level off the property. So we are higher than the wetland around us. But then they managed it with a very light hand. So we have really rare things like bottle gentian here
Mm,
because it wouldn't have been here because it was a wetland forest. So now the
right.
diversity between the forest margins, the pond itself, and the pond margins is mind blowing
Wow.
because they just managed it with such a light hand all those years.
Hmm.
Now I have gone to the length of digging bits and pieces out of my lawn and putting them in other people's lawns because it moves that
Yeah.
biodiversity around. And then you
Yeah.
get things like meadow fritillaries in Joe Citizen's lawn.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing.
That's a good
And
thing.
you can learn these lessons from what we do,
Hmm.
from observing nature and seeing how nature responds to things and how we can improve things.
Hmm.
So we've made a series. There's a beautiful horse paddock across the street, just pastoral. You just calm down as soon as you see it.
Hmm.
But it's a horse paddock, and there's a drainage swale that runs from there under the road through my lawn and then
Oh,
into the pond. So we built a couple of rain gardens to
okay.
capture phytoremediate, so where plants clean water or anything, and
Yeah.
then soak it into the ground. And then the soil microbiome does a really good job at breaking down organic matter as well. So by the time it goes underground to the pond, into the springs that feed the pond, then it'll be crystal clear. So
Okay.
that there are things that we can do. We've
Yeah.
pulled the mowing back 3 feet from the pond, which adds to the really cool things that grow there anyway. That's how we found
Hmm.
we knew we had a few of these orchids. We pulled back the mowing. Good Lord, they're everywhere. I saw a painted turtle laying eggs in the lawn. So I rushed out and I got some 2x4s and some wire mesh and I made a turtle protection cover. It's got a little hole cut out of it so that the
Okay.
turtles can get to the pond, but it stops creatures like skunks from digging up the turtle eggs.
Right.
Well, that's got to sit there till December. They laid them in, I think, June, early June, I think. And so there it stayed, and the grass grew through it. And then when fall came, I'm like, good Lord, the Ladies Tresses orchids are way back here, which means if we pull the mowing back 15 feet from the pond, 20 feet from the pond, we're going to have thousands of these orchids. Well,
Right.
I guess we already do. They're there.
Yeah.
They're just getting mowed. So
Mm.
like really eye-opening stuff and cool.
Hmm.
Every day I see new. I do a lot on iNaturalist.
Yes.
I'm
Okay.
downright addicted to iNaturalist. So if you looked at where I live on iNaturalist, it's a shotgun blast of species.
Right.
Everything from fungi to birds, eagles, osprey,
Wow.
little green
Yeah.
herons, you name it,
Oh.
and a plentitude of insects.
Hmm.
So
And you live
yeah,
in a
just
large
following nature's
property.
key.
Yeah, and you live
Yeah,
in a large property, but I think you also inspire us that even if we live on a smaller property, we still can
sure.
have, maybe not the same things that you have, but we can have what's native to our area, right? Or
And you
natural.
can have the same things.
Hmm.
My old garden, we had a refugia pile. So I'm forever trying to teach people to not get rid of the sticks, pick some shrubs and pile them behind the shrubs. Nobody walked into my garden and went, "What's with the pile of sticks?" Because it was behind a bunch of snowberry shrubs. Um, and the year before we moved, we had shrews in the garden.
Mm.
Nature's most voracious creature by body mass, little tiny mouse-sized thing, but they eat tons of pests in the garden, and they were living in the refugia pile. So,
Okay.
like even in a little tiny, and because of the snowberry, we had snowberry clearwing. Looks like a miniature hummingbird. It's a type of moth, and very rare. So you can have these things even in a small property and if you can little bit by little bit your neighbors will come around and you can give them
Yes, yes.
divide a piece of nice aster and give it to them and now they have a native plant amongst their boxwoods and hydrangeas
Yes.
and that is food for something.
Hmm.
So these ideas spread. When I moved in, there was my old place, there was a little creekway beside my house, and
Mhm.
everybody mowed the creek. You're just a bad citizen if you don't mow your bit of the creek. And I started mowing my bit of the creek because I'm a good citizen, even though we had chimney crayfish, really cool creatures. Um, and then one day I went, wait a minute, why am I doing this? And I stopped mowing, and everybody looked over the fence and went, you can do that?
Oh,
And everybody stopped mowing.
oh,
And it became a wildlife corridor through like a third of Milton. And the
wow.
biodiversity, now that creatures could get back and forth,
Mhm.
just skyrocketed in everyone's garden. Now you still get people going, oh, but there's skunks. No, skunks don't like wet feet. That's not gonna, you're not, it's not a skunk highway. And
Yeah.
also stop bothering the skunks. They'll let you know. I've walked up and filmed skunks. As long as you're not threatening,
Yeah.
all the stereotypical stuff, use a soft voice. I'm not saying people should go up and start pestering skunks, but use it, learn how nature works. Use a
Yeah.
soft voice. Don't run directly at something.
Mhm.
Nature's not gonna attack you. Coyotes keep freaking people out because they'll walk beside you and stare at you. It is called escorting behavior.
Oh, okay.
Don't run away. Learn
Yeah.
how nature works, but also, don't be afraid. Be
Yeah.
cautious. Be
Yeah.
cautious around all things, just like they're cautious around us. Like there's so many lessons that you can learn.
From
We
nature.
have a pack of coyotes here. Um, they don't cause us any grief. We've seen them, but they stay on their side and we stay on our side, and we're both quite fascinated by each other. I think we
Yeah.
also have great horned owls and screech owls. And believe it or not, there's a family of sandhill cranes and a family of trumpeter swans that nest near here. Like, how cool is that? I'm 17 minutes outside Milton, like outside a major population zone, 120,000 people. 17
Yeah.
minutes away is all this amazing wildlife.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think there's so
anyway,
much around us if we have to stop and take a look. And I think this is a great message to people to continue to just do less in
yeah,
the garden. Like I think we all need to do less and
yeah,
let and I think that's one thing about the pollinators is people think they need to do more, but I think in a way
other way around.
we
Yeah,
need to do less and they will come and the host plants and that was
yeah,
a very good point for mentioning about the host plants that they need to food to eat.
yeah. And we're
Yeah.
both designers. Nobody
Yes.
comes to me asking for something sort of Palace of Versailles,
Mhm.
but people's first words, I'm not out of the car yet. They're going, low maintenance. We want low
Exactly.
maintenance.
Exactly.
But then they go to great lengths to control everything. Just let
Yeah.
it go, man.
Yeah.
Enjoy it.
Yeah. Yeah,
Teach your
for sure.
kids. You want to have fun in the garden? Take your kids out looking for wildlife.
Yes.
Show them bees. Show them creepy spiders. I don't love spiders, but they fascinate the heck out of me.
Mhm.
There are many spiders cataloged on iNaturalist because I'm like, "Ugh,
Mhm.
snap."
Yes.
Um, but it's all cool,
Yeah.
and it's every day is the more you learn, the more fascinating it gets.
Mhm.
I'm trying to learn my bird calls, so I have a an app called BirdNet. There's also one called Merlin, and it will help you identify the bird calls.
Okay.
And so, I wasn't very good at that. That's no, I sucked at that. And now I'm getting not horrible at it.
Yes, yes.
Bit by bit, I'm learning more and more. And don't
Oh,
think you can learn it all in a
yeah.
day. Don't think you
Yeah.
can learn it all, period. Like you and I,
Yes.
we're good at what we do, but I
Yeah.
don't know everything.
Exactly.
I'm always learning.
Yeah.
That's
And
the
that's
joy
and me
of
too. That's why I love
gardening and
doing the
nature.
show, right? I love doing
Yeah.
the show. And I know what you mean. I'm married into a birding family. And so I've learned a lot and my mother-in-law was teaching my boys from a young age.
Awesome.
So they
Yeah.
really had a huge advantage there. So yeah, there's
Most of the
always
reason I
so
travel,
much.
the excuse is to go see birds.
Mhm.
I see other things,
Yeah.
but when I'm there, I'll hire a guide and go into the mountains
Oh,
or to the wetlands or whatever.
yes.
And that's always worth the money to me is hire a
Oh,
guide for a day because they know
yes.
where things are.
Mhm.
Um, Animals are creatures of habit. We were in Costa Rica with my guide Leo,
Oh, yes.
and he barely looked to his left. We were walking along, and he goes, "Oh, what was it? There's a crested owl."
Yeah.
And I looked over there. Good Lord, there is too. He's just sitting
Yeah.
there. He's always
Oh,
sitting there. Really?
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, that was one of their big trips, going to Costa Rica, and they did that. They hired and did a lot of, a lot of that. And Alaska, we did a trip to Alaska, and bird sanctuary was on
Ooh.
the list, so my mother-in-law could see.
I'm so
how
envious.
they were, helping, yeah, they were
Cool.
really
Wow.
wonderful. So yeah,
Neat.
I've learned a lot. And just as a side note, not to make you sad, but we just lost my mother-in-law a few days ago. And I just think
Oh,
of when you bringing up all of that, and that's all what she's taught me, what she taught my
yep.
children, and she taught many others. So I think birding is, and paying attention to nature and passing that torch on. I'm doing what I do because of her. So this is a little tribute
Yeah.
show for her. It wasn't going to be, but I
Yeah.
think you've just brought up enough memories. And I know I have their massive box of birding books that I don't want to just get rid of. I want to make sure they
Yeah.
go to people. And yeah, there's so much more to gardening,
Hmm.
and even when we talk about pests on this show, the main topic was jumping worms, to just spread the word and educate everybody. But I think that it
Yeah.
shows you how multifaceted that is, right? And paying attention to your
Absolutely.
soil, paying attention to where you get your plants, where you get your compost, moving
Yeah.
your soil around, that type of thing. So we've learned a lot today, Sean. I really appreciate this.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for the opportunity. It's always a pleasure talking to you and
Yeah.
sharing information with you back
Yes.
and forth. It's never a
Yes.
one-way street.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this episode of Down the Garden Path. Thank you very much, Sean, doing this with me. I enjoy hosting Down the Garden Path, bringing you interesting and relevant topics like this one to help you achieve a great garden. We learn right along with you from our research and from the guests who join us on the show. Don't forget, you can spend time with us down the garden path. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Down the Garden Path Podcast. We love hearing from our listeners, so you can always write us also at Down the Garden Path Podcast at hotmail.com. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us down the garden path.